compassionism. In the name of appearing compassionate, policymakers have actually allowed people to live in conditions that we would never, ever tolerate for people we actually love.
I'm still getting to grips with the American environmentalist movement.
They're actually increasing carbon emissions. We're shipping it in from Iraq, Venezuela, Ecuador, shipping in oil that we could perfectly well be producing here on giant supertankers, which run on bunker fuel, which is the most polluting form of fuel on the planet, fighting this war on fossil fuels. It's total insanity. So if you just look at the data of what has happened in California, it's truly shocking.
First, I want to probably understand the extent of the problem.
The topic on many California voters' minds is the state's housing crisis.
Firefighters continue to rein in those wildfires in Southern California. The cost of electricity has gotten out of hand.
In a way, I think the most powerful measurement is the fact that people are leaving. All of these things, as I say, are the direct result of policy choices. So the good news, I suppose, is that you can reverse them. And
perhaps we could start with homelessness, because this is the thing that's most visible when I visit San Francisco.
In fact, I use the word pathology to describe it, because some of it is pathological. It doesn't actually make any sense.
Before you hear from Steve Hilton, I ask if you want to support this show. All you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Steve Hilton exploring the issues you want to hear about and the mainstream media won't touch. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you'll get exclusive content, videos, interviews, and ad-free viewing. But without further ado, Steve Hilton. Steve Hilton, thank you for joining me on the show. Our paths have crossed a few times in our lives, as we were talking about before we started taping. But you have announced you are running to be governor of California.
Yes.
And you also have a book out, Caliphalia, where you identify all the problems with this place. We've just arrived. It's unbelievably gorgeous weather, and it's kind of hard to believe, particularly where we've come back from Britain and where it's bleak in every possible domain. So you're going to have to sell it to me why California needs you. But before we do that, maybe you can explain what is going on with California. Why is it in such a terrible way?
In one way, and this is what I think, there's nowhere better than California. Even now, even with all the terrible policies that have made life such a struggle for so many people, and we can get into that in a second. That's really the subject of my book, Caliphalia, how this place has been so mismanaged, run so badly, and it's been a complete failure. Despite all that, it is an amazing place, and that's really what motivates me to do this. You know, we moved here in 2012. We were just saying that was the year that I was trying to remember when I'd seen you perform. And I definitely remember 2012 because it was the year that we moved here. And almost the last thing I did working for David Cameron when he was Prime Minister was go to the state dinner with President Obama at the White House, where you were
We were the entertainment.
Exactly, you were the entertainment. So I definitely remember that. And I do remember another time I saw you at Glastonbury, but I used to go pretty frequently, so I can't remember exactly which year you must have.
No one remembers what happens at Glastonbury. Exactly. I think that's the whole plan.
The whole point. Exactly.
For those listening, there's a wink going on there.
Exactly. No, look, we've been here since 2012. Raised my family here, started a business here, taught at Stanford. It's an amazing place. But actually, if you just look at the data, remember in the pandemic, they tell you, follow the data. So if you just look at the data, the facts of what has happened in California, especially over the last few years, it's truly shocking when you compare California's outcomes to the rest of the country.
Give me the data. Paint this picture of how things are.
I mean, a simple way of summarizing it, and I say this often when I've been on the road talking to people around the state, is right now California is bottom of every list that you want to be the top of and top of every list that you want to be at the bottom of. And it's not much of an exaggeration. We have the highest rate of poverty in America. Not like the highest number. We're a big state, so often if you just talk in pure numbers, we're going to be the biggest. The percentage of the population living in poverty, higher in California than any other state.
What is the rate?
It's just about 30%. I mean, just over 30% can't meet their basic needs. So that's an enormous proportion of the population who are really struggling. So basic needs means shelter, food, etc. Like you've got a huge proportion of California that just can't make it. That's, by the way, why so many people are leaving.
How many people are leaving?
Well, I mean, net, you can see over the last few decades, it's been about 600,000. You've got inflows from immigration, but you've got net outflows every year for the last year, hundreds of thousands of people leaving, businesses leaving. And you just think, well, why would anyone leave a place as amazing and magnificent and beautiful as California? Because you just can't live here. If you go down the list, we have the highest housing costs in America, the highest prices for pretty much everything that's essential: electricity, gas, water, all of it, the most expensive in America. We have the highest homelessness rate by far. We have basically 11% of the population and 45% of the homeless population in America. It's
45% of homeless,
unsheltered homeless people living on the streets.
45% of all homeless people in America live in California.
Exactly. Unsheltered homeless, people who are just on the streets.
Now, is that because the weather's good enough that if you are homeless, it's a better life to go out there? Or is there some other reason?
No, there's other parts of America that are warm, but it's because all of these things are the direct result of Democrat policy, and we can get into each one. But if you go on down the list, we have the worst business climate in the country, which is insane when you think about California in many people's imagination. Certainly my imagination, before we even lived here, I thought of California as like the best of America, the absolute essence of America. And in particular, when it comes to business, enterprise and innovation and startup hustle and all of that. And yet, Chief Executive magazine, they do a survey every year of what it's like to do business in all the different states. California's been bottom for the last 10 years. So it's just an unbelievable list of failures. Unemployment, another one. For most of 2024, California had the highest rate of unemployment in America. Unbelievable. I mean, right now, the last time I checked, we were second. So, tiny bit of progress.
What is the rate of unemployment?
I think it was over 5%, something like that, by far the highest in the country.
Okay.
But for most of last year. And so you've got these failings on a statistical level, where you just the basics of good governance. And there's more, lowest income growth, and there's so many ways you can measure that. But in a way, I think the most powerful measurement is the fact that people are leaving. California used to be the place where everyone would flock to live the American dream. In fact, when you think of the American dream, you kind of imagine
the Hollywood Hills and
California and the beautiful weather and a home to raise your family. All of those things are just impossible to achieve now. I mean, if you go down the list of other, crime, education, the schools are a disaster. We used to have we were famous for the best public education system probably in the world. And so all of these things, as I say, are the direct result of policy choices. So the good news, I suppose, is that you can reverse them. And that's why I'm doing this, because I think that on every single one of these issues, you can turn things around. I don't want to say quickly, because nothing is easy and nothing can be done quickly, but you can start to put things back on track by, I think, getting back to just common sense, practical policies. Because the real argument, I think, that I wanted to make, going back to the book, Califalia, is that all of the real reason for all this is that ideology has driven everything for the last few years. And that is why the people who've been in charge, they've just sort of completely lost touch with delivering real positive outcomes for the people they're supposed to work for, which is the residents, the citizens of California.
I want to get into the ideologies. I want to get into what you want to do about it. We'll get into that. But first, I want to probably understand the extent of the problem.
Yes.
And I think that would be helpful.
Yeah.
So perhaps we can start with homelessness, because this is the thing that's most visible when I visit San Francisco, unless Xi Jinping happens to be in town.
Exactly.
I've walked out my hotel room. I remember this at the end of 2022, this happened. I walked out and someone literally took a dump in front of me on the middle of the street. And, the whole of is it the Mission District in downtown?
Tenderloin in particular.
Tenderloin.
Yeah.
It's unrecognizable from what I remember when I first came there 20 odd years ago. So a similar thing going on in Los Angeles here in Skid Row. And I wondered if you could explain to me what exactly has happened in regards to what's the picture of the homelessness situation?
I don't want to pretend any of this is simple. You've got a number of different elements. And remember, I used to be a policy guy in the government in 10 Downing Street. So I approach these things from that perspective. What are the specific policy ingredients that have led to this terrible outcome? But I do think it is, I will say one thing in terms of the overall point it is ideological. In the book, in Califalia, I'm trying to identify what are the drivers of this failure and the components of the ideology that's run rampant. And in fact, I use the word pathology to describe it, because some of it is pathological. It doesn't actually make any sense. It's so extreme. And one of the ones that I think has done the most damage in the book, and is totally directly related to this homelessness issue, is compassionism. And I use that word compassionism rather than compassion, because in the name of appearing compassionate, policymakers in California have actually allowed people to live in conditions that we would never, ever tolerate for people we actually loved.
What would be an example of compassionism?
Let's go through them one by one. In terms of homelessness, so it's absolutely true. I want to actually, let's do a sort of journey of how someone might end up living in these unimaginable conditions on the streets. People make the point that it's a housing issue. There's not enough affordable housing, and that's why you have the homelessness crisis. There's definitely a connection, obviously, between lack of affordable housing and homelessness. So let's just take that. Let's imagine you're someone who's a perfectly respectable person, you've got a steady job, and you're renting an apartment, and it's all fine. And then you lose your job, and you don't have savings, and you don't have family ties. Maybe you've moved from another state. You don't have a kind of rich social network, and you can't afford to pay your rent. So what do? Well, maybe you live on people's couches for a little bit, spare room, that kind of thing. And then there's a point at which that runs out. And let's say you haven't found another job, and etc. Then it's a very easy spiral to imagine. This happens to a lot of people. So you end up maybe living in your car. That happens unbelievably in the richest country in the world. You have people's families sometimes living in car. A single mother with children in a car, and then they have to go to school that day. I mean, this is what's going on. And then you can't afford the car anymore. And so within the space of months, a year or so, you end up going from someone who we would all consider to be a perfectly normal, everyday, respectable life to living on the street.
Mm-hmm.
Now, even if you didn't, at the point you arrived there, you weren't suffering from mental health problems or drug addiction. But if you live in those incredibly stressful conditions, you're a target for drug dealers and criminal gangs, and the incredible stress of doing that, of living in that way, creates mental health problems. And that's where you end up with the data point that anyone who's working with homeless people acknowledges, which is over 80% of the people who are living on the streets in that way suffer from mental health problems or drug addiction problems, or both.
Okay, so just on that, I don't deny that there are cases of that, but that's actually different to the argument that Michael Schellenberger, a previous independent gubernatorial candidate for California, made in his book San Francisco, which is that the reason they become homeless is actually the genesis is either mental health issues, or drug addiction.
I don't disagree with that. And so what I'm really saying, I strongly agree with that. What I'm really saying is that even there are some people who resist that argument, and they would say that's too derogatory for those, and you're smearing homeless people as drug addicts. And the reason I went through that process there is to say that even in the best case, right, it's real compassion is to understand that even in that situation, people who never were in the position of having mental health or drug problems can still get them once they become homeless. So whichever way you look at it, whether you take the immediate route, which is you've got mental health problems, you have drug addiction problems, and you end up homeless purely because of those factors, or if you never had those and you end up homeless, you're going to get those factors. So however you look at it, that's the problem.
Okay.
So that, in that sense, I totally agree with Michael. I mean, we've talked about this many times. So that's the actual problem: mental health, drug and alcohol addiction. So what we've seen happen over the last decade or more in California is that instead of treating those problems and using that as an opportunity to help people get their lives back on track, there's this. This is why I call it compassionist. It's like, we can't tell people what to do. We can't require them to get treatment for their problems, whether it's mental health or drug addiction or whatever. We can't require anyone to do anything. So where does that take you? Number one, it means that the homeless encampments are just left, and there have been various lawsuits that have stopped cities from clearing encampments and getting people into shelter. But that's really been an excuse. So I've got to break down the three components of the problem. We can go into each one.
Yes, let's
So
do that.
number one is the city authorities, or state authorities, the government in its broader sense, has allowed people physically to stay on the streets. That's problem number one. Number two, when they've provided solutions in terms of shelter or whatever, a law was passed in California called Housing First. Well, that wasn't the name of it, but that was the ideology that it represented. 2016. This was based on an approach to homelessness that actually came from the Obama administration, also known as Housing First. And the theory was, as the name suggests, when it comes to people who are living on the street, the first thing you do is give them somewhere to live. But it goes further than that. The Housing First ideology doesn't, and that, would make sense to people. But what it actually means in California, the Housing First law that was passed in California in 2016 means that that any organization providing homelessness services cannot require sobriety or any kind of behavioral response in exchange for those services.
Mm-hmm.
So you literally it's illegal to deal with the core problem. That's still the law in California.
Right.
So number one is not clearing homeless and allowing people to live permanently on the streets. Number two is not requiring any kind of response in exchange for services, getting on a path to clean yourself off, to get off drugs or whatever. And then the third element, specifically on mental health, is that there's a massive lack of mental health treatment facilities, a huge gap there. One of the reasons for that is that when you look at the economics of mental health care provision, a lot of it is based on reimbursement from Medicaid, from the federal healthcare system. And there's a rule since the beginning of Medicaid, there's been a rule, they call it the IMD rule, cannot be reimbursed for any facility with more than 16 beds. It's highly precise. 16 beds. That makes it, and this was all coming from the 60s in terms of the sense of, revulsion against kind of mental asylums and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and all that kind of, popular rejection of all of that. So the rule was put in place that mental health facilities can't be more than 16 beds. But that makes it impossible to run them in any kind of, efficient manner because it's just very expensive. Now, the Trump administration put in place a waiver from that IMD rule that states could apply for a waiver and get money from the federal government for mental health facilities that were bigger. California hasn't done that. So those are the three core things that need to be done. Now, on the first one, which is clearing homeless encampments, the governments in California, city, state, county, whatever, they hid behind a ruling, the Ninth Circuit ruling called the Boise ruling, after the city in Idaho where this arose, where the judges rule that you can't clear people off the streets if they're in a homeless encampment unless you have sufficient shelter available. That was the rule. That was the judgment in this case. And that stood, I can't remember, I think 2008. It's been there a while. But it's been used as an excuse because the ruling didn't define what shelter actually looked like. It didn't say you have to provide a particular level of shelter or accommodation. It was just the word shelter.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's been interpreted by what Michael Schellenberger coined the term, I think, first, the homeless industrial complex. Mm-hmm. Which is an incredibly corrupt connection between government funding, property developers, and homelessness nonprofits. And so where that has ended up in California is that government money from various sources has been used to provide what is called permanent supportive housing, which is basically an apartment unit for a homeless person that they build. The cost of building these in Los Angeles, $700,000 per unit, $800,000. I was just hearing.
I've heard up to $1 million.
$1 million in the Bay Area. Insane.
Yeah.
And who's making money off of that? The homeless nonprofits and the developers.
If I can illustrate your point.
None of that is necessary because there's nothing in that court ruling that would have ruled out providing simple shelter beds in a much cheaper facility. But they interpret, the government's almost deliberately over-interpreted it. Now, since last year, this has been going through the courts, and there's a new ruling, Grants Pass versus Oregon, that actually overturned that. So finally, you are seeing some movement, and you are seeing some cities in California taking action. But it's total bullshit, frankly, that they couldn't have done this years ago. But sorry to go into the detail, but it's really
detail, yeah.
Because people can. It's a good question. Like, how on earth was this allowed to happen? And the truth is that it's been this misguided approach of, well, it's not good. We can't sort of force people to do anything, hence housing first. You can't require people to take treatment. You can't clear them off the streets because we have to have fantastic apartments. But the point that anyone who works with homeless people makes is that it's a disaster to take people off. If you have a drug addiction problem and you put someone on their own in an apartment, that doesn't work at all because they're not going to. And so you need to be treated in congregate settings with real experts who are there to help you get your life back on track. That's what we need to get back to. It's actually my California policy organization, Golden Together. We worked on a plan around this, and the vision I think we need to see is recovery shelters where it's nothing like as expensive as we've been seeing for these apartment units, but you actually give people the treatment that they need, and it needs to be much better than the shelters that we have now, because what's going on now is that you have these shelters where you put everyone all in together. You have single mothers with particular set of problems, right side by side with a veteran, side by side with someone who's got a criminal past, all together. It's a total disaster. There was a recent investigation into the publicly funded homelessness shelters in California. It's an absolute scandal how bad they are. So this whole area of policy needs to be completely rebuilt from the ground up.
Since 2019, under Gavin Newsom, presumably he'll be your competitor.
No, he's not running.
He's not running?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Do we know who the Democrat...
There's a number. Well, the one we're waiting for is Kamala Harris. She's known that she's strongly considering running for governor, so we'll see.
Such fun.
There's a few who are out. There's Katie Porter, who was the member of Congress from Orange County. She's announced. There's a guy called Javier Becerra, who was HHS Secretary, Health and Human Services. Disastrous in that role under Joe Biden. And my favorite thing about him is that Joe Biden couldn't even get his name right, even though he's in his own cabinet. So Javier Becerra, as Joe Biden called him.
Wow. So $24 billion has been spent under Newsom since 2019.
It's more than that, but that's the number
on homelessness and housing.
Yes.
And yet, homelessness has increased from 30,000 to 181,000.
Yes.
Right. So I think that perhaps illustrates.
But these numbers are way. I mean, anyone working in the area will tell you these numbers are. I mean, the scale of it is right. The directional trend is right, but the problem is much, much bigger even than the official statistics suggest.
Back to your point one, then you said they're being allowed to be on the streets, I think, if I've understood this right.
But that's been the case. Now, that is changing.
At what point are the police and law enforcement not allowed to move them? Why are they hamstrung?
Because of this ruling. So they're saying that the Boise ruling, that's a very important ruling that was the Ninth Circuit, where they said, well, we can't because unless we have sufficient shelter bed available, we're breaking the law. We're breaking the terms of the Boise ruling. But that's because they defined shelter in a particular way. And that's why police and law enforcement just didn't do this, because they were and the point you make is exactly right. It's against the law. It's illegal to live there. Each city has anti-camping ordinances, local laws that prevent this, but they weren't enforced.
So just back to the mental health. Do you think that Trump's waiver then on the capacity for these
yes, from the
mental
first
health
administration?
institutions?
Yeah.
Oh, that was in the first Trump term?
Yes.
Okay. And is it still in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Motion? Okay. So what difference has that made then in, let's say, 8 years?
Well, none in California, because California didn't apply for it.
Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't have individual institutions applied to it?
I actually truly can't explain that. Other states have done it.
So what difference? So if they're not even applying for it, even though you're arguing that it would make things better?
Well, it would make it easier to have. It would make it easier to fund larger scale mental health facilities, so you could treat people in a modern and humane way. in bigger facilities, so it's more affordable. If every single
No, I get that principle, but I just
they
don't
just
understand why
haven't.
it's not. Why hasn't it?
you asked,
Well, you're running. So what are you going to do to encourage them
apply
to?
for the waiver and fund the mental health facilities.
And where are you going to get the funding for that?
Well, partly Medicaid is federal government. It's
Okay,
reimbursement.
so they'll get extra funding through.
Yeah.
Okay.
But also the other point to bear in mind is that there's a lot of detail to address, because Gavin Newsom last year, 2024, championed a ballot initiative, which was sold to the voters as the dealing with this problem once and for all. And it was a big bond, basically a tax increase, but in the form of a bond, and it was going to fund mental health treatment and all that. So it sounded very positive. But actually, when you look at the that's why I opposed it at the time, because when you look at the detail of it, actually, the money, one of the things that was actually contained within his ballot initiative designed, as he said, to address the mental health aspect of this problem, cut the budgets of local counties for mental health services and redirected it into building housing. But building housing without addressing all the other reasons that housing is so expensive, the environmental regulations, the labor regulations, the permitting, and we can get into all of that. Why do we have the highest housing costs in the country? Well, the same factors that have led to California having these insane costs for housing. I mean, the median house price in California, home price in California, is nearly $1 million. Unbelievable amounts. And that's driven by Democrat policy in a whole range of different areas.
Let's go into that.
None of those things are being addressed in the provision of shelter for homeless people. So if you don't deal with that problem, you're going to continue to waste that $24 billion number that you cited was the state auditor saying this is the amount of money that has been spent dealing with homelessness, and we can't find any explanation for what actually happened. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
So can you explain then, unpack the housing crisis?
The sort of top line is very simple. Supply and demand. We're not building enough housing. Everyone acknowledges that. It used to be the case that California was the most affordable place to live in America. It's unbelievable to imagine that
when
now.
Was that?
Like in the sort of 60s, 70s, but within living memory for a lot of people here. I think in today's money, I can't remember the exact number, but after taking account of inflation, compared to the nearly $1 million now for a median house price, back then it's like $180,000. And so, and that was the spirit of California. We can build and we can do things. You can come here and live the dream. And a lot of that was, and if you imagine what that looks like, it's the suburban dream. It's single family homes and building outwards. Now that has now been completely under assault for the last actually more than a few years, for at least a decade or more. Really driven by another aspect of the ideological extremism, which is the climate ideology. I call it climatism, which basically has argued that the only kind of development that's acceptable is infill development within the existing development footprint.
What's infill?
Like building inside an existing town or city boundary. Brownfield sites,
Okay.
some people call it. So you can't do what we did before and build suburbs and build outwards. And the argument that they use is it's all about density. We have to have density. We have to build in the urban core. Why? Because we don't want people driving cars, because that's bad for climate and so on. So it's climate driven. So that's been a huge part of it. That's been one of the reasons that you can't build. But actually, when you unpack the housing issue, like so much else in California, it's just this accumulation of total bullshit that just hasn't been addressed because no one's paid attention to it. So if you unpack it for a little bit, number one, no one really knows about this, but there's these things called impact fees, which are paid by house builders when they build a house. And it used to be couple of grand for a permit for the local environmental improvements. The name relates to the fact that if you build housing, it has an impact on the local community and the environment. So it makes sense. And there would be separate fees for things like parks or playgrounds or whatever. Local thing, an environmental inspection report, those kinds of things. Impact fees. now they've ballooned to unbelievable levels. I mean, the Berkeley Center, the Turner Center on Housing in Berkeley, estimated that a typical impact fees for one unit of housing in California, $150,000, $100,000. There were stories in San Francisco of $300,000 for one apartment unit. Not for the whole building, but for one apartment. So that's a straight up tax on housing. That's not shown. You don't see it's paid by the builder. Obviously, it's passed on to the buyer. So no one's even aware of that. That's one factor.
Yeah.
And remember, this is on top of the fact that we already have the highest taxes in the country. So it's not as if this revenue is, I mean, we paid local, property taxes that are supposed to fund the schools and local amenities. So this is all on top of that. It's just this insatiable demand for higher and higher taxes. So that's item one, right? Impact fees. I call it the Democrats' housing tax.
Mm-hmm.
That needs to be dealt with. Number two is the fact that you just can't build on the scale that we need. One of the main factors in that, people talk about environmental legislation, and you see Ezra Klein talking about it in his recent book Abundance, and he's absolutely right. They talk about CEQA, or that's an acronym CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. That was passed in 1970, signed by Governor Reagan, and it was originally designed to stop polluting factories and that kind of thing. But over the years, it's been extended to absolutely everything. And the crucial thing is that the right to implement it, as it were, to enforce it, has been given to everyone. So you have this thing called the private right of action. Anyone can bring a lawsuit under CEQA to block anything, basically. Now, when you look at the lawsuits that are filed under CEQA, 70% of them are used to block housing. Most of those are filed by unions. Nothing to do with the environment. They're filed by unions in order to use as leverage against the house builders to get whatever they want for their members.
So it's unions from within construction industries.
Exactly. And so right now, there's a colleague that I work with, again, at my policy organization, Golden Together, Jennifer Hernandez. She's a Democrat, has worked on these issues for decades. She calls it green Jim Crow, because the people who are losing out from this are working class people who can't get on that ladder of opportunity because they're totally priced out.
Wow.
And it's driven by a lot of this climate stuff, and it's driven by unions who are theoretically acting in the interest of their members, but they're I'll give you a specific example.
Yeah.
So what they often, what this often ends up in is a demand. They file a lawsuit, and then there's a negotiation, and often that ends in what's called a project labor agreement. So a specific labor agreement for that project, as the name suggests. What are the components of that? They're typically two. These brilliant euphemisms. So one is skilled and trained. You have to use skilled and trained labor. Who could object to that? Well, what that actually means is union members only. It's like a closed shop. I was talking to some people, house builders doing a small development, and they're saying, we had a project labor agreement, and even for carpet fitters, we had to use union workers, but there aren't any where we were operating. So we have to bust them in from the San Francisco Bay Area and put them up in hotels, and just adds to the cost. Another component is what they call prevailing wage. Again, sounds reasonable. What it actually means is much higher wages than the market rate. And of course, we want people to be well paid. I'm pro-worker. We've talked about populism. That's a big part of what I want to see. People paid well for the job that they do, but not like 4 times the market rate, so that the cost of the housing becomes so high that even the people who work on it can't afford to live there.
Yeah.
So again, real numbers. In the Central Valley, I was talking to some house builders. I said, what does this look like in practice? They had one project, which was a market rate project. So a team of plumbers working on that. $25 to $40 an hour was the rate. The exact same workers going to a project labor agreement job in the same town, same people, $95 to $120 an hour. So it's a massive increase. And this is what's been going on. So then you add to it, in 2018, going back to the climate point,
actually, before we go back to the climate point, just on unions, this might be a bit of a tangent, but I'm interested by it. Trump won the unions. Well, he didn't win the majority of unions, but he did win the white male and female, the non-educated white male and female unions. And so you're running on a Republican ticket, but
Yes,
you're running against what you're kind of describing as a deadlock caused by unions.
well, specifically on housing.
Yeah.
But I think that, the basic point is what do I want to see? I want to see the California dream available to everyone, in particular those who've been shut out of it. The people who've been really hammered by this far left extremism in California are working class people in California. They're the ones who can't even dream of buying their own home and having that security for their family. The very simple basics of the life that we want for people. A good job that pays enough to raise your family in a home of your own, in a safe neighborhood with a good school, so your kids have a better
So,
life.
Steve, are you going to be going up against the unions, or are you?
No, I don't. I think that this on the particular issue of housing, I think we've got to come to an agreement that this is insane. That we it's no good doing this kind of deal if it means that the housing is so expensive that union workers can't afford to buy their own home. I think that is a common sense position.
Right.
That I'd want to sit down with the unions and workers generally and say, look, we've got to fix this problem because it's off the charts how expensive it is. It's not just a little bit more. It's totally unaffordable. It's the number one reason people are leaving California, high housing costs. There's a firefighter it's an unbelievable story, but this is what's happening. A firefighter in Orange County loves his job, didn't want to leave it, loves working there, so expensive, couldn't afford a home, decided to move the family, his wife and kids, to Tennessee so they could buy a house and live the kind of way they wanted to live. And he commutes to Orange County.
No.
Yes. It's a real story. It's in my book. And there's others like that, just insane stories of people just priced out of living. So this is what's been going on. That's why another big theme of the book Caliphalia was elitism, because all these policies that make sense to a kind of academic, on an academic sense, or to, ideologues who live comfortably in San Francisco or wherever, working class people can't afford this stuff.
Yeah. Well,
everything is so expensive.
I'll come back to elitism and the other ideologies, but just wanted to go back to Green Jim Crow. Do you say that because these policies are disproportionately affecting black communities?
Latinos in California. I mean, if you look at it's really it's the biggest group in California now. If you just very simple sort of ethnic breakdown in California, 40% Latino, 30% white, 15% Asian, 5% black. So this is a Latino state. And because of these policies, people who just want that basic opportunity of a shot at the California dream, in particular Latinos, are just totally excluded from it. So Jennifer Hernandez, herself a Latina, coined that term because thinking with she herself comes from that background, as do I, not Latino obviously, but working class background, and that sense of upward mobility that you want for working class people is just totally not there in California as a result of this. And the climate policies are particularly and I wouldn't even call, they make no sense. It's pathological. That's why I use that term, because they don't make any sense even in their own right, but they have a particular negative impact on the kind of daily life of working class people in California.
Yeah, I'm still getting to grips with the American environmentalist movement, particularly as when we arrived, the big news is that Tesla's EVs, electric vehicles, are being destroyed up and down the country. And so it's kind of odd to me that the people who are pro the climate, there's a natural vehicle that is at least a company that's attempting to be more environmental.
Well, exactly. It doesn't make any... it's all just...
To what extent do you agree with there being issues around climate change?
No, I support sensible climate action. But what
is sensible?
Well, it's a good idea to reduce pollution, and I think it's a good idea to reduce carbon emissions. So if we think that, then why don't we actually support carbon-free electricity generation in the form of nuclear power? Why don't we prioritize that? Safe, reliable, affordable carbon-free power. But they're not doing that. Instead, in the name of climate, they're actually increasing carbon emissions. If you look at the actual consequences of their energy policies, it increases carbon emissions.
So what would be an example of their policy?
So number one, on fossil fuels, oil and gas. So in California, there's no oil pipeline into California. So whatever oil and gas that we're using, not gas, there are gas pipelines on oil. Let's just stick to oil. Whatever oil, and of course that's crude oil is the main, is what turns into gas to drive people's cars. So, and power much of the transportation sector as well as a whole range of other uses. So that oil that we use in California has to be either produced in California or shipped to California. So we actually have plentiful oil and gas reserves in California. Not that long ago, again, a few decades ago, basically we produced roughly 80% of the oil and gas we use here in California, mostly in Kern County, Kern. It's at the southern end of the Central Valley. Bakersfield is the big oil town there. And so we had a very thriving energy industry. You drive around LA, you see it. You see the oil wells. People sometimes are surprised to see that. You run it near LAX.
Yeah.
Go to Long Beach. So we have very healthy oil deposits in California. So that was a few decades ago. 80% was produced in state, and the rest we shipped in. A lot of it from Alaska, mostly Alaska actually. Now it's after years of the war on fossil fuels. So successive Democrat administrations have basically progressively shut down the oil industry. They won't issue permits for new fields. You can't even repair an oil well. I've been to see it. It's just they've been shutting it down, adding more and more regulations, making it more difficult to operate here. And so that's been their policy. And they're very open about it. The war on fossil fuels, net zero, all this stuff. But what's the end result? It's not that we're using a bit less. The actual consumption has gone down by about 7%, I think. But if you look at just oil, if you look specifically at the proportion of our total energy in California that we use that comes from fossil fuels, it's 80%. Right across everything, transportation, electricity generation, everything, 80%. For the rest of America, it's 81%. So what's it all been for? They haven't even reduced the dominance. What's actually been happening is that they've shut down production here in California, but we're importing it from around the world. And so what's actually happening is we're shipping it in from like Iraq, Venezuela, Ecuador, shipping in oil that we could perfectly well be producing here on giant supertankers, which run on bunker fuel, which is the most polluting form of fuel on the planet. So they're shipping it in halfway across the world.
Wow.
Instead of producing it here because they want to look like they're fighting this war on fossil fuels. It's total insanity.
In Britain, we've been importing solar panels which are made with coal in China.
No, exactly. Well, there you are.
But we're not in California. It's not even that. You're literally just importing the oil from somewhere else.
Exactly. It's totally insane. So that's what I say. Which increases carbon emissions. By the way, to make it work, this is how insane the whole thing is. They passed laws requiring companies to take account of carbon emissions throughout their supply chain. But there's a big exception. The oil tankers bringing in the oil from Iraq, they don't have to account for their carbon emissions. They only count them 12 miles off the coast of California. It's just magical thinking. It's just that's what I mean. It doesn't make any sense. So if you I'm not interested actually in having a debate about those kinds of things. I'm just saying that how do we power our economy with a simple way of putting it. Let's have affordable, reliable energy that is as clean as possible. I think everyone can agree about that. Right. Well, if you're going to do that, then as long as we're using oil and gas in California, let's use the oil we have here.
Mm-hmm.
And just take it in nice, clean pipelines from Kern County to the refineries in the LA area on the coast. And so let's do that. Let's build nuclear generating instead of shutting it down. Let's have new nuclear.
Have they been shutting nuclear?
Yes, they shut down San Onofre down on the coast near San Diego. They keep.
Why did they shut that down?
Because they're anti-nuclear. which is insane if you actually care about carbon emissions. It's the best form of reliable carbon-free electricity
Forgive me
generation.
for another sidetrack, but why are they anti-nuclear?
It's probably cultural. I don't know. It's a great question. There's the green position has been to be anti-nuclear. Greenpeace back in the day in the UK, vehemently anti-nuclear. So I think that they would say it's based on safety, but actually, I mean, Michael Schellenberg is fantastic on this. You know, he just goes through the data. I mean, it's the safest form of energy production there is.
Yeah.
If you actually look at actual deaths and injuries and so on. So I think that's the excuse. But I think, like with so many of these things, that's why it's pathological. They just don't like it. I don't think there's a rational explanation. And there's a mania for wind and solar, an absolute obsession with wind and solar. So guess what they're doing? Instead of it's so insane, it's hard to believe. So they've just granted, not granted, they're going ahead with wind farms off the coast of California, destroying the marine ecosystem. It's so bizarre, it's hard to believe, but this is the plan. It's never been done anywhere in the world. They don't want it close to the coast. They're like 20 miles off the coast. The ocean's incredibly deep, so you can't put them in the ocean floor. So they're going to have floating wind turbines. No, I know, floating wind turbines, 1,000 feet high, right? That's the height of the Eiffel Tower. I know. This is it's real. This is what they're saying they're going to do. They're going to have thousands of, I think 2,500, to produce what they claim it will produce, floating wind turbines the height of the Eiffel Tower in the ocean off the coast of California.
For any Californians listening, forgive me for laughing.
No, but just
it's
imagine
a bit of a tragedy.
The industrialization of our coastline that would involve.
These
giant floating things and the cables and it's just nuts.
There presumably is more wind out there than there is here. I mean, you're not one for sun. That you've got plenty of sun. Yes, but in Britain we're bringing in solar panels, and we're not famous for sun.
Solar thing, that's exactly right. So look, I'm not against rooftop solar. I think I've always believed in decentralized energy and the way that you can get in, if you give people control over their lives and energy. That's fantastic, and it makes sense in California. Solar panels on your roof. You have a battery, and then you can really be your own. You're not dependent on the grid. I love that. It's independence. It's fantastic. But what we're doing now with these solar farms. But by the way, there used to be incentives in California for people to install rooftop solar. They took them away. They're against rooftop solar. Instead, they want these giant industrialized solar farms. This is what's actually happening. This is the insanity of it. In the Central Valley in California, which is the best agricultural land in the world, the most fertile soil, the best growing conditions, with the world's top. The Central Valley of California is like the best agricultural region in the world. I love going there. It's incredible. It's being that industry. We produce 80% of the world's almonds, around 70% of the world's pistachios, the biggest tomato growth. It's an amazing fertile place. You have citrus, you have everything. It's being shut down deliberately by Democrat policy, starving them of water to grow the food that we consume and could lead the world in. But also the solar farms. I mean, this is what's so disgusting. They're actually they're taking away the water from the farmers so they can't make a go of it, growing. And also, by the way, the healthy food that we should be eating. This isn't like vast fields of soybeans or whatever to make high fructose corn syrup and whatever, wheat and corn, all that, which you see in the Midwest and elsewhere. This is fruit and vegetables and nuts, exactly what we should be eating. We want to, deal with the chronic health epidemic, all that stuff, chronic disease. But we're shutting it down. So they're starving the farmers of water. So they can't make a go of it growing things. So many of them are selling out now to private equity firms, pushing solar farms. So now you're seeing actual farmland replaced by solar farms. And here's another unbelievable thing if you go there, if you put a solar farm in next to an actual farm, the solar, because it's such a giant heat, it sucks in all the heat. It actually raises the temperature in the local area. To grow many, like tree nuts, almonds, pistachios, and so on, they need it's called chill hours. You need a certain number of hours per year where the temperature is below a certain level in order for the nuts to grow properly. And if you put, I think it's something like 10,000 hours below a certain temperature. when you put in a solar farm, it makes the local environment hotter. So actually, the solar panels, the solar farms that are put there in the name of climate change are changing the climate locally. So the farmers can't grow their stuff. This is so insane. Like, that's what I mean. It's just incomprehensible to me that they've gone down this path. And every single area of policy you look at, you've got this ideological extremism instead of positive, practical, common sense things that actually help people. That's what we need to get back to. That's why I'm running for governor.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I know your time is precious and you've got to run on to do your next bit of media. Thank you for speaking with me. I think we only really scratched the surface there. I wanted to get more into the elitism and the compassionism, and you even said at the beginning that schools are a disaster. Maybe that's a whole other.
I think so. There's a lot. There's a lot to talk. There's many things wrong in California. It will take us a long time to diagnose them all. But I think we've got to start somewhere. You've got to start turning things around. Because here's the thing. I just want to leave it at this. And this is why I think it's so important that we do this, because actually California represents something so fantastic in the imagination of the world. We can't let it fail. There's a line in my book, and I say it all the time at every event: California means to America what America means to the world. Everything that's great about America, the boldness and the ambition and the hustle and innovation and the rebel spirit, all that stuff, right? That's captured here in California. We've got to get back to that. That's why the theme of my campaign is make California golden again. With a golden state, we can be that once again.
Okay. Well, Steve Hilton, a pleasure to speak with you, and all the best with your gubernatorial run.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Steve Hilton. If you want to support this show, remember, all you have to do is press subscribe. And if you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Steve Hilton exploring the issues you want to hear about and the mainstream media won't touch. If you go over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you'll have exclusive videos and ad-free viewing. But until next time, be well.